First off, philosophy is a confession. What's good, y'all? Thanks for clicking on the link. As the thumbnail said in the title, this is my video on addiction. What it is, why we have it, what you can do about it, and even a couple of tricks to replace your dopamine with something else. We will start off with a brief overview of my story, which is I was a hardcore opiate addict. Well, actually just addict across the board. But drug of choice was opioids. At one point I had 300 milligram oxy habit daily. I've been to rehab, detox 7 times, and in jail just as many. 10 years ago it led to a stroke. I now do not have use of my left side. I've been clean for 10 years since I had the stroke. If you're struggling out there with your addiction and you've gone repeatedly to detox, to rehab, it's cool. But I promise you want to chill out before you have a stroke. You don't want to. Trust me. Anyways, here we go. Enjoy the video. I love you guys. I'll see you at the end with a little recap. Enjoy.
One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family, including later cocaine addiction. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer, because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction? Why do we carry on with this approach that doesn't seem to be working? And is there a better way out there that we could try instead? So I read loads of stuff about it, and I couldn't really find the answers I was looking for. So I thought, okay, I'll go and sit with different people around the world who lived this and studied this and talk to them and see if I can learn from them. And I didn't realize I would end up going over 30,000 miles at the start, but I ended up going and meeting loads of different people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, Portugal. And the thing I realized that really blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. And if we start to absorb the new evidence about addiction, I think we're going to have to change a lot more than our drug policies. But let's start with what we think we know, what I thought I know, right? Let's think about this middle row here, right? Imagine all of you for 20 days now went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Some of you look a little bit more enthusiastic than others at this prospect. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. First thing that alerted me to the fact something not right with this story is when it was explained to me, if I step out of this TED Talk today and I get hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much better heroin than you're ever going to buy on the streets, because the stuff you buy from a drug dealer is contaminated. Actually, very little of it is heroin, whereas the stuff you get from the doctor is medically pure. And you'll be given it for quite a long period of time. There are loads of people in this room who may not realize that you've taken quite a lot of heroin, right? And anyone watching this anywhere in the world, this is happening. And if what we believe about addiction is right, those people are exposed to all those chemical hooks. What should happen? They should become addicts. This has been studied really carefully. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed if your grandmother had a hip replacement, she didn't come out as a junkie. And when I learned this, it just seemed so weird to me, so contrary to everything I'd been told, everything I thought I knew. I just thought it couldn't be right. Until I went and met a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who carried out an incredible experiment that I think really helps us to understand this issue. Professor Alexander explained to me, the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads, that story, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can do them tonight when you go home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when he first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats. They're quite different to us, maybe not as different as we'd like, but, But fortunately, there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings. And I think, at first I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, but one way that helped me to think about it is, and I can see, I've got over by my seat there a bottle of water, right? I'm looking at lots of you, and lots of you have bottles of water with you, right? Forget drugs, forget the drug war. Totally legally, all of those bottles of water could be bottles of vodka, right? We could all be getting drunk, I might after this. But we're not, right? Now, because you've been able to afford the approximately £1 gazillion that it costs to get into a TED Talk, I'm guessing you guys could afford to be drinking vodka for the next 6 months. You wouldn't end up homeless. You're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping you. It's because you've got bonds and connections that you want to be present for. You've got work you love. You've got people you love. You've got healthy relationships. And a core part of addiction, I came to think, and I believe the evidence suggests, is about not being able to bear to be present in your life. Now, this has really significant implications. The most obvious implications are for the war on drugs, right? In Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and go out on chain gangs and dig graves while members of the public could jeer at them. And when those women get out of prison, they're going to have criminal records that mean they'll never work in the legal economy again. Now, that's a very extreme example, obviously, in the case of the chain gang. But actually, almost everywhere in the world, we treat addicts to punish them, we shame them, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them reconnecting. There was a doctor in Canada, Dr. Gabor Maté, an amazing man, who said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design that system. Now, there's a place that decided to do the exact opposite, and I went there to see how it worked. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year, they tried the American way more and more. They punished people and stigmatized them and shamed them more. And every year, the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on with a country where we're having ever more people becoming heroin addicts. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And they set up a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. João Goulão to look at all this new evidence. And they came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with the society. And that's not, essentially, that's not really what we think of. What they did wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and Britain. So they do residential rehab, they do psychological therapy that does have some value. But the biggest thing they did was the complete opposite of what we do. A massive program of job creation for addicts and micro loans for addicts to set up small businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And when I went and met the addicts in Portugal, it was fascinating. What they said is, as they rediscovered purpose, they rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It'll be 15 years this year since that experiment began, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down, HIV is massively down among addicts, addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it's worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system. Now that's the kind of political implications. I actually think there's a layer of implications to all this research below that. You know, we live in a culture where people feel really increasingly vulnerable to all sorts of addictions, whether it's to their smartphones or to shopping or to eating. You know, before these talks began, you guys know this, that we were told we weren't allowed to have our smartphones on. And I have to say, a lot of you looked an awful lot like addicts who were being told their dealer was going to be unavailable for the next couple of hours. And, you know, a lot of us feel like that. And it might sound weird to say, oh, you know, I've been talking about how disconnection is a major driver of addiction, but weird to say it's growing because you think, well, we're the most connected society there's ever been, surely. But I increasingly began to think that the connection we have, the connections we have, we think we have, are like a kind of parody of human connection. If you have a crisis in your life, you'll notice something. It won't be your Twitter followers who come to sit with you. It won't be your Facebook friends who help you turn it round. It'll be your flesh and blood friends who you have deep and nuanced and textured face-to-face relationships with. And I think there's a study I learned about from Bill McKibben, the environmental writer, I think tells us a lot about this. It looked at the number of close friends the average American believes they can call on in a crisis. That number has been declining steadily since the 1950s. The amount of floor space an individual has in their home has been steadily increasing. And I think that's like a metaphor for the choice we've made as a culture, right? We've traded floor space for friends, we've traded stuff for connections, and the result is that we are one of the loneliest societies there has ever been. And yet Bruce Alexander, the guy who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery, and it's right to talk about that, but we need to talk much more about social recovery. Something's gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we've created a society where for a lot of us, life looks a whole lot more like that isolated cage and a whole lot less like Rat Park. But if I'm honest, this isn't why I went into it, right? I didn't go in to discover the political stuff, the social stuff. I wanted to know how to help the people I love. And when I came back from this long journey and I'd learned all this, I looked at the addicts in my life, and if you're really candid, it's hard loving an addict, and there's going to be lots of people who know in this room you are angry a lot of the time. And I think one of the reasons why this debate is so charged is because it runs through the heart of each of us, right? Everyone has a bit of them that looks at an addict and thinks, I wish someone would just stop you. And the kind of script we're told for how to deal with the addicts in our life is typified by, I think, by the reality show Intervention. If you guys haven't seen it, I think everything in our lives is typified by reality TV, but that's another TED Talk. If you've never seen the show Intervention, it's a pretty simple premise. Get an addict, all the people in their life, and say, if you don't shape up, they confront them with what they're doing, and they say, if you don't shape up, we're going to cut you off, right? So what they do is they take the connection to the addict and they threaten it. They make it contingent on the addict behaving the way they want. And I began to see why that approach doesn't work. And I began to think that almost that's like the importing of the logic of the drug war into our private lives. So I was thinking, well, how can I be Portuguese, right? And what I try to do now, and I can't tell you I do it consistently, and I can't tell you it's easy, is to say to the addicts in my life that I want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in. And if you need me, I'll come and sit with you because I love you and I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you're not alone, we love you, has to be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Thank you.
So an addiction is a complex psychological, physiological process, but which manifests in any behavior that a person enjoys, finds relief in, and therefore craves in the short term, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up despite the negative consequences. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, Neuroscience has said nothing about substances. I said any behavior. So it could be related to cocaine, crystal meth, heroin, fentanyl, marijuana, nicotine, alcohol, whatever. Could also be sex, gambling, internet, relationships, shopping, eating, work, extreme sports, working out, pornography, any number of human activities. So I said any behavior. Now, the official definition of addiction, according to the American Society for Addiction Medicine, is that this is it's a primary brain disorder. It arises in the brain, largely due to genetic reasons. This is how they see it. And I say that's just not true. The other popular idea about addiction is that it's a choice that somebody makes, that people choose to be addicted, which is what the legal system is based on. Because if people are not choosing, what are we punishing them for? And although I think the medical definition is closer to the truth, I don't see it as it's a genetic disorder, and I don't see it as a primary brain disorder. So let me perhaps show you why, if that's okay. A human being has two fundamental needs, apart from the physical needs, in infancy, in childhood. One is for attachment. Now, attachment is the closeness and proximity with another human being for the sake of being looked after, or for the sake of looking after the other. Now, human beings, as mammals, and even birds, are creatures of attachment. We have to connect and attach because otherwise we don't survive. If there's nobody that's motivated to take care of us, to attach to us that way, and we're not motivated to attach to others, we just can't survive. One of the interesting things is that the endorphins, which are the body's internal opiate chemicals, which heroin and all the other opiates resemble, they help to facilitate attachment. So if you take infant mice and you knock out their endorphin receptors so they don't have endorphin, opiate activity in their brain, they won't cry for help and separate from their mothers, which would mean that they would die in the wild. And which goes back to what happens early in childhood when there's stress and trauma, these endorphin systems don't develop. And then when people do heroin, it feels like a warm, soft hug to them. They feel love and connection for the first time. That's why it's so powerful. But so we have this need for attachment, without which obviously the human infant, who is the most helpless, the most dependent, the least mature of any creature in the universe at birth, cannot survive without the attachment. And that attachment relationship, given that we have the longest period of development of any creature, well into adolescence and beyond, attachment is not a negotiable need. But we have another need, which is authenticity. Now, authenticity, auto to self, means being connected to ourselves. Just knowing what we feel and being able to act on it. So, that means our gut feelings. So, let's look at how human beings evolved. For hundreds of thousands of years, and for 100,000 years or so of this species existing on Earth, how did we live? We didn't live in cities and houses and so on. We lived out there in the wild until very recently in human existence. Now, just how long do you survive in the wild if you're not connected to your gut feelings? Not very long. If you start using your intellect instead of your gut feelings, you just don't survive. So that's a powerful survival need as well. So attachment is a survival need, authenticity is a survival need. But what happens if your authenticity threatens your attachment relationships? For example, as a 2-year-old, you get angry because you didn't get that cookie before dinner. But your parents can't handle anger because they grew up in homes when there was rageaholism and they're terrified at the very expression of anger. So they give you the message that good little kids don't get angry. The message you receive is not that good little kids don't get angry, but that angry little kids don't get loved. Because your parents are now sullen, they won't look at you, they talk to you in a harsh way, you're not getting loved. Not experiencing love at that moment. No, but you gotta stay attached. Guess what you're gonna suppress? The authenticity every time. And this is how we lose connection to ourselves and to our gut feelings. So that, strangely enough, that very dynamic, which is essential for human survival in a natural setting, not becomes a threat to our survival in this more modern setting, where to stay authentic is to threaten attachment. And so we give up our authenticity, and then we wonder who the hell we are, and whose life is this, and who's experiencing all this, and this life doesn't, and who am I really? And so that's where the reconnection has to happen. That's where the healing happens, is with that reconnection. But it's because of that conflict, that tragic conflict in childhood between authenticity and attachment that most of us face, that we lose ourselves and lose connection to our gut feelings. Now, this leads to the question of trauma, because it's one thing to recognize that all this originates in childhood pain. It's quite another to transform that pain. And for that, we have to understand what trauma is. So people often think that trauma is what happens to you. So trauma is a divorce when you were small and your parents fighting. Trauma is your mother's depression. Trauma is your father's alcoholism. Trauma is your parents' argumentation. Trauma is physical or sexual abuse or some loss. Those aren't the traumas. Those are traumatic. But the trauma is not what happens to you. The trauma is what happens inside you. And as a result of these traumatic events, what happens inside you is you get disconnected from your emotions, and you're disconnected from your body, and you have difficulty being in the present moment, and you develop a negative view of your world, and a negative view of yourself, and a defensive view of other people. And these perspectives keep showing up in your life in the present. So in other words, the addiction is not the primary problem, it's an attempt to solve a problem. And then the real question is, how did the problem arise? In other words, this is where my theory is that it's always rooted in childhood trauma, and that the addiction is an attempt to deal with the effects of childhood trauma, which it does temporarily, while it creates even more problems in the long term. And so the issue is not just to recognize what happened 10, 15, 30, however many years ago, but to actually recognize the manifestations in the present moment and to transcend them. And how do you do that? By reconnecting with yourself, by restoring the connection with your body primarily and with your emotions that you lost. And once you do, when you found these things again, then you have what we call recovery. Because what does it mean to recover something? It means to find it again. So what is it that people find when they recover? They find themselves. And the loss of self is the essence of trauma. So the real purpose of addiction treatment, mental health treatment, any kind of healing is reconnection.
Do you still today, with everything going on, believe that trauma is one of the main contributing factors to addiction?
If I can just begin by talking about what addiction is and ask you a question about it, then the answer to your inquiry will emerge, okay? So addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary relief or pleasure in and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences and has difficulty giving up despite the negative consequence. So that's what an addiction is. Okay? Now, so craving, pleasure, relief in the short term, harm in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, notice that in my definition, I said nothing about drugs. I said any behavior. So it could be drugs, of course, cocaine, crystal meth, opiates, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine. Would also be sex, gambling, pornography, shopping, eating, work, internet, gaming, just about anything. And the question I always ask people, and I'm going to ask you this now. So you've had your addictions. I don't know your personal history, but I don't need to know what it was. What I'm going to ask you is this, not what you're addicted to, but what did it give you in the short term that you wanted? What did you crave about it?
Security, numbing of pain, escaping, gave me peace of mind.
Okay, peace of mind, security, numbing of pain. Are those good things or bad things in themselves?
Innately, they're good, right? We need those things.
Who doesn't want security? Who doesn't want peace of mind? Who doesn't want relief from pain? In other words, the addiction wasn't your primary problem. It wasn't the disease. The addiction was your attempt to solve the problem of emotional pain, the problem of lack of peace, the lack of security. Then if we ask, what is the source of the pain? What is the lack of security all about? Why don't you have peace of mind? We get to trauma. So the fundamental cause of all addictions, and I don't care what they are too, is always trauma that results in us having emotional pain, distress, lack of peace. So my mantra around addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And to understand people's pain, you have to look into their life histories. Not this idea that you got this genetic disease, which is complete nonsense, it's scientific nonsense. Not this idea that you made some bad choices, because I never met a single person in my medical career, or since or before, who ever chose to be an addict. The question is, why were you in pain? What did you need to run away from? And that answer is always just rooted in trauma.
Yes. And I agree with you. And I've often said to people that once you get into recovery, like that's where a lot of the work starts, because now you have to really look at like why you were using whatever substance or thing in the first place to cope or numb pain, and begin to find healthier coping mechanisms to heal from that and then grow into a better version of yourself. If you could explain, I guess, for maybe people listening to this that maybe they're not as familiar on the impact of trauma and what it does to our brains and the neuroscience of it, if you could explain to the best of your ability, like how does trauma change our brains?
Sure. So first of all, what is trauma? So the actual meaning of the word trauma is a wound. That's the Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is a physical or a psychological wounding. So what causes that wounding? What causes that wounding is either when bad things happen that shouldn't have happened, such as happened to a lot of people, such as sexual abuse in childhood, emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, an emotionally very unsafe family environment in the midst of a divorce or family conflict, violence in the family, a parent being addicted, a parent being jailed, a parent dying, neglect. These are very wounding experiences for young children. Very wounding. But there's another way you can wound people as well, which is not just by doing bad things to them that shouldn't have happened, but by not giving them the needs, not giving them what they need. So children can be wounded by being hurt in the ways that I talked about, but they can also be wounded if their essential needs for human development are not met. A lot of families where there's no overt trauma as such, children are still wounded because they're not seen for who they are, not accepted for who they are, not valued for who they are. When there's pressures on them to be different other than the way they are, that can also wound children. Now, what are the impacts of that? If you understand about the human, here's the thing. You can take an acorn, and you can say that it's the nature of the acorn to become a mighty oak tree, which it is. But is that going to happen automatically? If I put that acorn on my desk, will it ever become an oak tree? Never. Because for healthy development of that acorn, certain conditions need to be met. The same thing is true for human development. So for the brain to develop properly, you need the right environment. Now, the human brain develops, I'm quoting now, so craving pleasure, relief in the short term, harm in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, notice that in my definition, I said nothing about drugs. I said any behavior. So it could be drugs, of course, cocaine, crystal meth, opiates, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine. Could also be sex, gambling, pornography, shopping, eating, work, internet, gaming, just about anything. And the question I always ask people, and I'm going to ask you this now. So you've had your addictions. I don't know your personal history, but I don't need to know what it was. What I'm going to ask you is this, not what you were addicted to, but what did it give you in the short term that you wanted? What did you crave about it?
Security, numbing of pain, escaping, gave me peace of mind.
Okay, peace of mind, security, numbing of pain. Are those good things or bad things in themselves?
Innately, they're good, right? We need those things.
Who doesn't want security? Who doesn't want peace of mind? Who doesn't want relief from pain? In other words, the addiction wasn't your primary problem. It wasn't the disease. The addiction was your attempt to solve the problem of emotional pain, the problem of lack of peace, the lack of security. Then if we ask, what is the source of the pain? What is the lack of security all about? Why don't you have peace of mind? We get to trauma. So the fundamental cause of all addictions, and I don't care what they are to, is always trauma that results in us having emotional pain, distress, lack of peace. So my mantra around addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And to understand people's pain, you have to look into their life histories. Not this idea that you got this genetic disease, which is complete nonsense, it's scientific nonsense. Not this idea that you made some bad choices, because I never met a single person in my medical career, or since or before, who ever chose to be an addict. The question is, why were you in pain? What did you need to run away from? And that answer is always just rooted in trauma.
Yes. And I agree with you. And I've often said to people that once you get into recovery, like that's where a lot of the work starts, because now you have to really look at like why you were using whatever substance or thing in the first place to cope or numb pain, and begin to find healthier coping mechanisms to heal from that and then grow into a better version of yourself. If you could explain, I guess, for maybe people listening to this that maybe they're not as familiar on the impact of trauma and what it does to our brains and the neuroscience of it, if you could explain to the best of your ability, like how does trauma change our brains?
Sure. So first of all, what is trauma? So the actual meaning of the word trauma is a wound. That's the Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is a physical or a psychological wounding. So what causes that wounding? What causes that wounding is either when bad things happen that shouldn't have happened, such as happened to a lot of people, such as sexual abuse in childhood, emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, an emotionally very unsafe family environment in the midst of a divorce or family conflict, violence in the family, a parent being addicted, a parent being jailed, a parent dying, neglect. These are very wounding experiences for young children, very wounding. But there's another way you can wound people as well, which is not just by doing bad things to them that shouldn't have happened, but by not giving them the needs, not giving them what they need. So children can be wounded by being hurt in the ways that I talked about, but they can also be wounded if their essential needs for human development are not met. A lot of families where there's no overt trauma as such, children are still wounded because they're not seen for who they are, not accepted for who they are, not valued for who they are. When there's pressures on them to be different other than the way they are, that can also wound children. Now, what are the impacts of that? If you understand about the human, here's the thing. You can take an acorn, and you can say that it's the nature of the acorn to become a mighty oak tree, which it is. But is that going to happen automatically? If I put that acorn on my desk, will it ever become an oak tree? Never. Because for healthy development of that acorn, certain conditions need to be met. The same thing is true for human development. So for the brain to develop properly, you need the right environment. Now, the human brain develops, addiction is not telling kids that drugs are bad. The reason is because the kids that listen to adults are not at risk, and the kids who are at risk don't listen to adults. So the prevention has to actually begin in the womb. So we got to start with pregnant women, because already these circuits are being potentiated in the womb. So you have to start with pregnant women and say, what are the stresses in your life? What's your relationship like? How much support are you getting? Because you want to create a peaceful environment in the womb for that infant already. The second thing I say to parents is, work on your own issues. Because any traumas that you haven't worked out in yourself, almost inevitably, you're going to pass it on to your kids, like I did. These things that I'm talking about now, I didn't know them when I was a young parent. And there was significant traumas that my wife had, that I had, that we haven't even realized yet. So that it's almost inevitable that parents who are not conscious will pass on their traumas to their kids. So work on your own issues. Really important. Number 3, children have certain needs. In my new book, The Myth of Normal, I have a chapter on the irreducible needs of children. Those needs include unconditional loving acceptance, the capacity to experience all their emotions, whether they're anger or joy or pain. Those emotions need to be received. In other words, the question you have to start off with as a parent is, what are the needs that my children have for healthy development? Both in this book, The Myth of Normal, and in a previous parenting book I wrote called Hold On To Your Kids, you have to start off not with what do we want our kids to be, or how do we want them to behave, but what are their needs for healthy development. And in this modern society, parents are really challenged to meet those needs.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, so I guess what you're saying is if a kid is screaming when it's mad or it's upset, a lot of times parents will take something away from them or put the kid in timeout. I guess what you're trying to say is that in itself could be something that could be detrimental to their emotional development.
Absolutely, I'm saying that. Let's imagine you're an adult in a relationship.
Right.
And what if your partner said to you, every time you feel anger, I'm going to make you go to your room and sit by yourself. How would that feel to you as an adult? Now, as a child, you're completely dependent on the parent. And in fact, you have this absolute need to belong to the parent and to be close to them, to be attached to them. When we say to a child, if you're angry, you have to separate from me, what you're saying to the child is, if you have a genuine feeling like anger, you can't have the relationship with me. I'm going to deprive you of what you need. In other words, we create a fear-based relationship with the child. No child develops properly under conditions of fear. And there's some very famous psychologists who counsel parents to separate. This whole idea of timeout is a toxic practice. If the punitive timeout, actually when a child is really upset, you know what they need? They need time in. They need to be held in. Oh, you're really angry, aren't you? Yes, I am. You must be really upset. Yeah. They need to be heard and held. Now, I'm not saying we put up with kids hitting their siblings. I'm not talking about permissive parenting. I'm talking about parenting that's attuned to the child. And so the more connection you have with the child, by the way, the more the child will want to do what you want them to do. But essentially, I'm talking about parenting where there's nothing the child can do to threaten the relationship. And every time I punish a child, a 2-year-old doesn't know why. They doesn't know why they're doing what they're doing. They're just doing what they're doing. They don't know intentional. There's no intentional circuits up there yet. But when we punish them, they don't know why we're punishing them. All we know is that they're not acceptable to us. So it's when the child is most upset that they most need you. And they most need your understanding.
And there's going to be some people, I think, listening to this that they're familiar with trauma in the sense of like severe things happening to them, whether it was some form of assault, maybe it was some form of violence, accident, like a death in the family at a young age, like whatever it was. And now they're hearing what you're talking about, and they might say, like maybe I have experienced some of this, but maybe they're a bit older and it's been some time since these things happened. What are some signs or symptoms like in adulthood that maybe somebody needs to go back and look into some of their trauma and heal from it?
It's very common for adults to recognize that something isn't working and therefore go back and what happened here. That was my case. I was a successful medical doctor. I had children. I was married. I was a respected member of the community, but I wasn't happy. I was depressed. And my children were actually afraid of me. And I had to ask myself, what's going on? I was married. I was a respected member of the community, but I wasn't happy. I was depressed. And my children were actually afraid of me. And I had to ask myself, what's going on here? So trauma, what you have to understand here is that trauma is not what happened to you. That's not what the trauma is. So trauma wasn't that there was neglect or divorce or bullying or abuse. That's not the trauma. That's the traumatic event. The trauma is the wound that you sustained as a result. So I'll give you a very personal example. When I was a year old, my mother gave me to a total stranger in the street to save my life. This was in Budapest, Hungary, Second World War. So I didn't see my mom, for 5 or 6 weeks. That was a traumatic event. The trauma was the wound that I came to believe that I wasn't wanted. When your mother gives you to a stranger and you don't see her for 5 or 6 weeks, what else can you conclude as a 1-year-old? That you're not wanted, you're not lovable. Natural conclusion for the child. The wound was not that I was given to the stranger. The wound was the impact, what happened inside me, that I wasn't lovable. So, 40 years later, 35 years later, I'm a parent, but I don't believe I'm lovable. So I become a workaholic doctor, so people will love me. I'm always available, day or night, beeper's always on, delivering babies, going to emergency wards, looking after dying people. Because I'm still trying to prove to myself that I'm lovable, that my life is worth something. What is the impact of my children? Daddy's always busy, he's never available. Work is more important to him. The impact on my children is they get the message, they're not lovable. So at some point, you have to start asking yourself, why am I behaving the way I'm behaving? When my partner doesn't look at me the right way, why do I feel so hurt? When the work that I'm doing is not satisfying me, why am I doing work that doesn't satisfy me? When I get an illness, like sometimes disease wakes people up. If I get an autoimmune disease, which women, by the way, get in much higher numbers than men do, we can talk about why. Or when I get depression, or let's say I have an addiction, what am I trying to run away from? So usually we have to suffer a little bit, or a lot actually, before we start asking the right questions. I wish we weren't like that as human beings, but you know what? I was like that. I didn't start asking the right questions until I realized I was suffering and I was creating suffering for others. Why? That's when the exploration begins.
Let's just think about addiction, because in biology and in psychology, frankly, it really often pays to think about the extremes first and then work our way towards more typical circumstances. And with that said, addiction, unfortunately, is very common nowadays. I just heard a statistic, in fact, that there is an 80% increase in alcohol use disorder among women in the last 30 years. I talked a little bit about this in the episode that I did about alcohol and health. Again, I want to be very clear, I'm not somebody that is completely against alcohol for adults, provided they're not alcoholics. Turns out 2 drinks a week, probably fine health-wise. 0 would be better. If we're honest, 0 is better than any alcohol. But 2 drinks a week is probably fine. Past 2 drinks, you start running into problems. And yet many, many people out there, male and female alike, suffer from alcohol use disorder, also called alcoholism. The same is also true for things like methamphetamine or cocaine or other types of substance addictions. And the same is also true for a lot of behavioral or what are sometimes called process addictions. Things like sex addiction or video game addiction or any type of behavior that frankly is leveraging the dopamine system, but that engages this progressive narrowing of the things that bring someone pleasure, such that nothing else is really salient. Nothing else is really pulling them in the way that their video games or sex or pornography or alcohol, pick your substance or, behavior that you see out there, or hopefully not, but that you might suffer from an addiction to. So what's happening in addiction? Well, addiction involves dopamine, among other things, often, the opioid system, etc. But if we were to think about what's the stimulus in an addiction and what's the peak in dopamine, and then what happens after that peak, it all becomes very clear as to why addiction happens and why it's so pernicious. So for instance, let's take cocaine. Cocaine causes dramatic increases in dopamine very, very fast. So if somebody craves cocaine, what are they craving? They're craving that dopamine peak. They're craving the increased level of alertness. they're craving that they're going to smoke. God forbid they're mainlining it, they're shooting into a vein. What happens is they snort, smoke, or inject cocaine, and dopamine levels almost immediately go up to a very high peak. Okay, so the time gap between the stimulus and the dopamine is very, very short. So short, in fact, that there's really no other contingencies in between that the mesocortical system has to learn. In fact, what does the system, quote unquote, learn? It learns cocaine equals massive amounts of dopamine equals feeling euphoric and energetic, etc. And in doing that, it reinforces the whole circuit so that that short, we can even say hyper short contingency is really what the system wants. So much so that longer contingencies of, say, putting in the hard work of, generating a fitness program or a professional program for yourself or a education program, which takes not just many days but many weeks and years, well, none of that is going to lead to peaks in dopamine that are as high as the peak in dopamine associated with cocaine. So that tells us something critical. It is both the duration between desire and effect. And when I say effect, I mean the rewarding properties of dopamine that are experienced. That's important. So very short gaps teach the system to expect and want short gaps. Makes it very hard to pursue things that take longer. So when we say it's the short, or in this case, hyper short distance or time between the stimulus and the dopamine, what we're really talking about, if we were to plot this out on a board or on a piece of paper, is the steepness of the rise of that peak. It's very, very steep. The peak in dopamine is coming up very fast after the desire. And in addition to that, and this is very important, the higher the peak in dopamine and the faster the rise to that peak, the further below baseline the dopamine drops after the drug wears off. Okay, so in the case of cocaine, it's a very fast and very large rise in dopamine, followed by a steep drop and very deep trough in dopamine below baseline. You say, okay, so there's pleasure, then there's lack of pleasure. But it's worse than that. Because it's not just lack of pleasure. If you recall what we talked about a little bit earlier, that drop below baseline triggers the desire and the pursuit for what? For more. And so this sets in motion a vicious loop where people start pursuing peaks in dopamine that can come very fast without much effort. And that's one of the ways in which addictions start to take hold. Now, there's a simple way to think about this and to remember if you want to avoid this whole thing. I mean, the first one is obvious. Don't do cocaine, don't try it, don't use it. Certainly don't get addicted to it. Those are all sort of one and the same, frankly. I don't know many people that, despite opinions to the contrary, that use cocaine recreationally, that don't at some point run into either a financial, psychological, physical, or some other problem. The other thing that's absolutely critical to keep in mind, and this was discussed in my colleague, Dr. Anna Lemke's book, Dopamine Nation, and on this podcast. Excellent book, by the way. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. It's a fascinating exploration into dopamine as it relates to addiction, not just drug addiction, but other types of addiction. Again, the name of that book is Dopamine Nation. We'll provide a link to it in the show note captions. The other thing that happens after those big, fast increases in dopamine caused by things like cocaine is afterwards, when it quickly drops below baseline, it takes a much longer time to get back to the original baseline than it did prior to using the drug. And worse still is that the peaks in dopamine that are created from more consumption of cocaine leads to progressively lower peaks and deeper troughs below baseline. So the whole system is shifting away from pleasure and more to pain and the desire for pursuit of the drug. So let's talk about the optimal way to engage in activities or to consume things that evoke dopamine. How are we supposed to engage with these dopamine-evoking activities in ways that are healthy and beneficial for us? How do we achieve these peaks in ways that are healthy and beneficial for us? How do we achieve these peaks, which are so central to our well-being and experience of life, without dropping our baseline? And the key lies in intermittent release of dopamine. The real key is to not expect or chase high levels of dopamine release every time we engage in these activities. Now, the smartphone is a very interesting tool for dopamine in light of all this. It's extremely common nowadays to see people texting and doing selfies and communicating in various ways, listening to podcasts, listening to music, doing all sorts of things while they engage in other activities, or going to dinner and texting other people, or making plans, sharing information. That's all wonderful. It gives depth and richness and color to life. But it isn't just about our distracted nature when we're engaging with the phone. It's also a way of layering in dopamine. And it's no surprise that levels of depression and lack of motivation are really on the increase. There's something called dopamine reward prediction error. When we expect something to happen, we are highly motivated to pursue it. If it happens, great. We get the reward. The reward comes in various chemical forms, including dopamine. And we are more likely to engage in that behavior again. This is the basis of casino gambling. This is how they keep you going back again and again and again, even though on average, the house really does win. Everything that we've talked about until now sets up an explanation or an interpretation of why interacting with digital technology can potentially lead to disruptions or lowering in baseline levels of dopamine. There's an intermittent schedule by which dopamine sometimes arrives, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot, sometimes a medium amount, okay? That intermittent reinforcement schedule is actually the best schedule to export to other activities. How do you do that? Well, first of all, if you are engaged in activities, school, sport, relationship, etc., where you experience a win, you should be very careful about allowing yourself to experience huge peaks in dopamine unless you're willing to suffer the crash that follows and waiting a period of time for it to come back up. What would this look like in the practical sense? Well, let's say you are somebody who really does enjoy exercise. Or let's say you're somebody who kind of likes exercise but forces yourself to do it, but you make it pleasureful by giving yourself your favorite cup of coffee first, or maybe taking a pre-workout drink, or taking an energy drink, or listening to your favorite music, and then you're in the gym and you're listening to your music. That all sounds great, right? Well, it is great, except that by layering together all these things to try and achieve that dopamine release, and by getting a big peak in dopamine, you're actually increasing the number of conditions required to achieve pleasure from that activity again. I can use a personal example for this. I happen to really enjoy working out. I've always really enjoyed it. But in recent years, I noticed that if I was bringing my phone to my workouts, then not only was I a little bit more distracted and not focusing on what I was doing as much as I could have or should have, but also I started to lose interest in what I was doing. It wasn't as pleasurable. I would feel like it just didn't have the same kind of oomph, and I was beginning to question my motivation. As I started learning more about this relationship between the peaks and the baselines in dopamine, what I realized was that some time ago I probably experienced an incredible increase in the amount of dopamine during one of my workouts because I enjoy working out and I enjoy listening to music. I also enjoy listening to podcasts. I also enjoy communicating with people. Those are all wonderful pursuits, but I had layered in too many of them too many times, and then it essentially wasn't working for me anymore. Much in the same way a drug wouldn't work for somebody who takes it repeatedly because their baseline of dopamine is dropping. So at least for this calendar year, I've made a rule for myself, which is I don't allow my phone into my workouts at all. No music, at least not from the phone. It can be in the room. I might listen to a podcast in the room, but I don't listen to anything or engage in anything on my phone, no texting whatsoever. And most of the time, I just don't even bring it with me for that period of time. It's only a short period of time. I'm not training that often. This is something that I think has been misinterpreted as people can't be alone now. People talk about, they can't walk across the street, or they can't go anywhere, ride the bus, can't be on the plane without being in contact. They can't handle just their thoughts. I don't think that's really what's going on. I think what's happened is that, which I personally enjoy, being able to communicate by phone, by text, and exchange pictures and send links and these kinds of things, social media. But then what happens is it doesn't have that same fulfilling aspect to it. And it tends to remove the excitement and the pleasure of the very activities that we are engaged in. So I know this is a hard one for many people, but I do invite you to try removing multiple sources of dopamine release, or what used to be multiple sources of dopamine release, from activities that you want to continue to enjoy or that you want to enjoy more. And now you understand the biological mechanisms that would underlie a statement like that. It takes a little bit of working with. I know it can be challenging in the first week or so of not engaging with the phone during any kind of workout. That actually was really tough. But now I'm back to a place where I enjoy it that much more. I also feel as if I conquered something in terms of the circuitry related to dopamine. I now understand why something that I enjoyed so much had become less pleasurable for me. And there's a deep, deep satisfaction that comes from understanding, okay, there wasn't anything wrong with me or what I was doing or anything at all. It was just there was something wrong with the approach I was taking, which was layering in all these sources of dopamine and dropping my baseline. If you want to maintain motivation for school, exercise, relationships, or pursuits of any duration and kind, the key thing is to make sure that the peak in dopamine, if it's very high, doesn't occur too often. And if something does occur very often, that you vary how much dopamine you experience with each engagement in that activity. So do like the casinos do. Certainly works for them. And for activities that you would like to continue to engage in over time, whatever those happen to be, start paying attention to the amount of dopamine and excitement and pleasure that you achieve with those, and start modulating that somewhat at random. That might be removing some of the dopamine releasing chemicals that you might take prior. Maybe you remove them every time, but then every once in a while you introduce them. Maybe it involves sometimes doing things socially that you enjoy doing socially, sometimes doing the same thing but alone. There are a lot of different ways to do this. There are a lot of different ways to approach this. But now knowing what you know about peaks and baselines in dopamine and understanding how important it is not just to achieve peaks, but to maintain that baseline at a healthy level, it should be straightforward for you to implement
works
these
way
intermittent
better
schedules.
than abstinence. I understand counting days and going to AA and surrounding yourself with like-minded people. That definitely does work if you work it. It didn't work for me though. I'll tell you what did work for me. Well, first off, I was addicted to hardcore narcotics, opiates and benzos. But what really has helped me is marijuana, pot. It is a lifesaver. Just don't be lazy. You can replace it with that easy, but you can't be lazy. If you're going to be lazy, then you can't go the pot route. You need to go abstinence. But this also, I'll make my case of, I think we should probably start preaching moderation over abstinence to our children. Experimenting is a part of growing up, and we can tell them to don't do drugs all we want, but they're going to do it as part of growing up. So let's start teaching moderation. It's the best lesson I ever learned from my dad, R.I.P. Too bad I just learned it about 20 years too late. I got it now, though. It's wonderful. I hope you can, too. Like I said, if you are an adult and you are already in active addiction, you need to put force up against that cycle or it is going to come back around. So you should probably be going to AA and get a sponsor and work the steps and all that good stuff. But if you're having trouble counting days and you keep slipping or something, I would recommend just go back to when it was cool to smoke pot every day. And you don't need alcohol either. I haven't drank alcohol since New Year's of 2022, I think. I don't even remember. It's been a long time. I don't even like it. It gives me a headache. Anyways, I love you guys. Stay strong if you're in active addiction and you are in that vicious cycle. Please stay strong, and you can message me private message me, any one of you. I don't care if you know me personally or not. On any of the, stay strong if you're in active addiction and you are in that vicious cycle. Please stay strong, and you can message me, private message me, any one of you. I don't care if you know me personally or not. On any of the platforms, if you're following me, just send me a message if you need some advice, and I will immediately respond to you. I promise. Stay strong, please, guys. I know how rough it is. I definitely know how rough it is. Mine ended with a stroke. Don't let it happen to you. Stop before it happens. Moderation over abstinence. I love you guys. Please remember to leave people better than you found them. You got to hug the hurt, befriend the lost, while loving the lonely. And go love somebody that you don't like. I'm going to wrap it up right here. Once again, I'm going to reiterate that I am here for you if you need me. I love you. See y'all next time. Hey, what's good, y'all? Thanks for clicking on the link. This is a little dopamine trick if you're not feeling really good, if you're feeling kind of depressed or something. This is a little trick to get you going in the back of your mind. It's called a dopamine loop, and I hope it helps you out as much as it helps me. And here we go. It's fairly simple. A trick. You just take a cup out of the cupboard, fill it with water, go ahead and get you a drink. When you're done with it, wash it off, dry it off, and put it back. Complete the loop. That's a dopamine loop. The back of your brain will love you for it. It doesn't, you know, you're not gonna feel like a $1,000,000, but it's gonna be in the back of your mind, helping that depression. So, dopamine loop. Hope you guys are doing all right. Love you. Go love somebody that you don't like. I'm out. Alright, that wraps it up for this one, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. You gotta learn something new every day, right? Hope you learned something. If you are struggling and need help, I am going to put a link down in the description for AA meeting, as well as help for addiction treatment. If you need to get into an inpatient place somewhere, I'm going to put all that in the description. I love you guys. Go love somebody that you don't like. I love you again, and y'all be good. See you next time. Like and subscribe.